more I watch Squadrons gameplay, the more I like it. It has its hooks on me for sure, and I feel like I pick up on more exciting details the more coverage I watch. That being said, there are still aspects I wish weren't there, were improved upon, or would be included in the final build. Most of the criticisms I have of this game are aspects that can be altered and not embedded into the design philosophy of the game, so it's not all that bad, and because of that I do still fall into the camp of people excited to play this game. That being said, let's get into the criticisms. The UI is just, I don't like it. First, the general UI choices aren't particularly impressive. By that I mean scoreboards, bad information, skill feed, and such is presented in a generic way, with an okay font and is sized and positioned in a serviceable manner, I guess. It's not terrible, it's just not particularly impressive. My main complaint is with the game UI elements that are present if you're not in instruments only mode. The colors, sizes, and shapes of the different elements are super generic, which is highly contrasted with the super well done instruments below them. The quality between them is night and day. And while there was always going to be a disconnect from how the instruments looked and how the additional UI elements looked, just how basic these were just disappointing. I especially hate the text like missile whatever, the incoming, which is redundant because of the ugly red chevrons already indicating that, or the points for the kill feed, because that information, I don't know if you noticed, is already at the top right of the screen. The text of these specific messages are redundant because you'll eventually get used to what the indicators that accompany them, and thus already on the screen mean. For a game that is going to force players into tutorials to learn the game, putting some text up just in case they missed it seems contradictory. My biggest problem is that all these elements are seemingly easy to trigger all at once, leaving the middle of your screen the only area where you can see the action filled with an overloaded and intrusive screen. They so easily overlap it can be difficult to tell what is happening at first. Like the weapon reticle, again with its basic design, constantly clashed with the lock-on reticle. My last complaints on the UI leave me irrationally angry. Why are there symbols for resupply and such when just having an area with a strong glowing light of a distinct color could have achieved the same thing? Why when you lock onto a ship and the ship flies out of sight does the lock-on reticle turn into this thing with a white background that looks like someone got bamboozled and didn't actually manage to get the PNG image they wanted? And why can't the gamer tags be masked by the visible elements of the ship's hull?
Is it just me or do all the fonts look really off? I have to agree with that. One of the first things I noticed when playing the game was that the UI, although limited since most of it is in the cockpit, felt very basic and kind of old, like it was from a 10 or 20-year-old game. I'm not sure if this is how it's gonna look when it's final, or if this was just like a beta version of the UI, but I agree that the UI, for instance, in Battlefront 2 looks better than the UI in Star Wars Squadrons.
There are certain aspects that come along with positioning your game as a multiplayer focused experience, and one of those is the expectation to enter a match as quickly as possible. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this, but if you don't know, Squadrons will, when you boot the game up for the first time, start you off in the story prologue. From there you'll be asked if you want to continue the story or not. When you want to play multiplayer, you'll have to play dogfights, as fleet battles are locked behind playing 5 rounds of this mode. Finally, when you enter fleet battles, the flagship mode, you'll be greeted by an interactive tutorial for the mode. Only after all of that will you be able to choose whichever mode you want from then forward. I generally don't understand this mentality. Starting out your game off with a prologue is fine or expected of a single player focused game rather than this, but we'll get to that in a bit. No, what I'm frustrated with the most and worry others will be turned off by is gating off modes, specifically the flagship game modes. The fleet battle tutorial doesn't really bother me at all. It probably just focuses on the logistics of the mode beyond anything else, but the fact that it will be yet another tutorial barring me from jumping in and having fun doesn't help it either. I can promise you all I'll be thinking is, just let me get into the game, I'll figure this shit out on my own, come on. In a multiplayer game, every match presents a learning opportunity, and with that comes improvement, especially huge improvements in the very early days. For the game to pull you aside and rob you of that organic nature is disingenuous and unfun. It leaves the player without a sense of trust, and will push the player to defy conventions you set for them. I mean, however, with the nature of this game, in terms of movement and tools, that could actually work to their advantage in a weird way, but who knows. I imagine the message that will invariably come up to halt the pacing of the story after the prologue, to ask you if you want to play online now, is going to be jarring. To what degree all depends on how good the prologue is, and creates a scenario that is bound to feel weird regardless. If the story is so good and you just want to keep playing, this bumping pacing will leave you asking why they simply just didn't put the menu first, so you didn't have to experience this bump early on. If you're not feeling the story, you'll question why the game starts like this, and does not just simply let you get into the multiplayer action. Basically, if it's good, you've rattled the pacing. If it's bad, you've wasted time. Having to unlock fleet battles isn't ideal. You're putting up guardrails, guiding me down a path on how to first experience this game. I get this isn't done in the name of control, proficiency, acquisition, but ironically, I'm not going to try to pick up the skills in games I'm obligated to participate in. I'm just going to rack up the number of matches and leave, ironically tarnishing my reputation of dogfights, keeping me away from it and not learning anything from my time with it. If you're not really on board with the path the game is going to try and take you down, then you might get frustrated, even to the point where other aspects of this game might take a hit to you for simply being involved in that process. The last criticism I have comes from my friend Alex, and the more I think about it, the more I agree, with some heavy caveats. The criticism focuses on a lack of a hardcore or whatever mode that would limit the Squadron of 5 to no respawns. This would basically turn it into a more tactical game akin to Rainbow Six Siege and the likes. Basically, tactics, communication, and strategic gameplay would be heavily required in order to win a round. My concept for this, and I'll keep this brief, is a round where one squadron has to defend a heavily damaged light cruiser from only one more enemy squadron in a specific time window. Multiple tactics here are valid but extremely risky. Maybe if you rush the defenders as the attacking team, you can overwhelm them, leaving the objective pretty open. Or you could go in with a tight formation that, if it works, will provide enough cover for your bomber to do sufficient damage. Anyway, my point here is that a strategic, well-planned, well-timed game plan would be required to pull off a victory on both sides. A hardcore mode almost sounds perfect for a game in this genre. The matches could be over in 30 seconds or could last down to the wire. Adaptability would be way more valued here, and I do think this would scratch a sort of an itch for players, especially for more niche gamers, such as Squadrons fans would tend to be. With all that, I think mostly a third, mostly hardcore and tactical mode would have really rounded out this game's multiplayer quite nicely. Again, most of my criticisms towards this game are nowhere near baked into the game's design philosophy. Some of them would be difficult to change up, and maybe I've just judged too harshly without trying it out or getting used to them. Maybe some of them will be changed before launch. Maybe Motive would be happy to change, or maybe Motive trust their convictions and don't see these as much criticisms at all. All I know is that with their philosophy of very little post-launch support, if some of these issues are shared by most of the community, it may be difficult to change. Kind of frustrating, because if this was in the style of Battlefront 2 and the community agreed with the criticism, well, it would be noted and the changes would be implemented. That being said, right now the game's positives are outweighing the negatives. For those of us in the right headspace, for a discount-priced Star Wars flight sim game made to be that exactly and that well, the game is shaping up rather nicely.
Error detected. Blast doors opening. Defend the reactor.